Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here is your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Wilson. It is Friday, September 30th, 2022. Welcome to another episode of People in Fundraising, a professional conversations podcast where I try to highlight people in the nonprofit world, get at the human interest side of their stories. And today I'm really delighted to welcome Nhu Huynh to our program, our podcast. Nhu, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Dynamite. Nhu is joining us from the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. And in the course of our conversation today, when it comes up, I think we'll refer to it as Booth, but just to give you the full institutional title. And Nhu is the Director of Research and Prospect Management at Booth. So, and you've been there for just under a year, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like 7 months.
Nice. What was that like joining a new employer, at this point in the pandemic?
It's actually a bit interesting because I joined a bit after the Omicron variant was dying down. And so people were returning to the office. I think it made a big difference in terms of onboarding that I got to meet people. At my old job at Loyola, Chicago, I had met my boss. Like, he left the institution like 4 weeks before I did, but we basically met for the first time the same month we both quit. And so it was such an odd experience. And so at Booth, like being able to meet people, and I'm a complete introvert, it's still been so impactful in terms of like learning about culture, learning about collaboration. It's been wonderful.
Oh, awesome. Excellent. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
So Nhu and I knew each other a bit when we both worked in prospect management and research in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Nhu was at Harvard's Central Prospect Development Shop, and I was across the river in Boston at the business school. So Nhu, if you want to take a few minutes, please, to share with our audience how you entered the nonprofit world. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I'd love to share my background. It, again, for like most people, circuitous and not something I planned when I was 18. I actually got my master's in theological studies at Harvard. I studied theology and philosophy at Boston College, my undergrad. And after my undergrad, I actually did volunteer work through the Archdiocese of Chicago via AmeriCorps, and basically like lived in an intentional community with others and did nonprofit work. And so I was a paralegal for 1 year working with detained immigrant children, and my second year working with men and women with developmental disabilities. And then decided to go back and get my master's because I wanted sort of the practice to align with like the philosophy, and really loved higher ed, but realized during my time that like the PhD track was not for me. That's like what I wanted to do. While I was at Harvard, I had a work study placement at a local nonprofit in Cambridge called Educators for Social Responsibility. And I was basically like their development associate. And I would like go into Wealth Engine and like look people up and do briefings. And so it was like prospect research, light. Like no one was training me, and I was just like pulling lists and, a little bit of everything. And then when I was graduating with my master's, really wanted again to stay in higher ed. I love like the mission-based work. And a part of it was like I was in an existential, place of confusion. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but knew I loved writing and knew I loved research. And I had a colleague at the time, Adele Beekman, who worked in the Central Alumni Affairs and Development Office at Harvard. And I was able actually not to get a job there because there was like limited turnover at the time. And the timing just didn't work out. And so I was actually a staff assistant for a long time, for not a long time, but for a few months in central HR. It's like, what did I ended up
Oh,
being able to get? And then when a job opened on that team in central A&D, like eventually pivoted to there, and then realized I like really enjoyed the work and
huh.
the research, like being curious about individuals, what drives them. And then obviously there's a whole nother like wealth piece to it. But that was really like my background in terms of like how I got into it, which was like not direct at all. But again, like
Sure.
love the writing piece. And for a while at Harvard for the due diligence request, so on like international prospects, our briefings were longer and kind of more like research papers. And
Right.
it kind of felt like I was like writing like a essay or whatnot.
Yeah.
And I think that aligned with a lot of my interests, but also, again, just like using resources and combining information and presenting it well to others. And in many
Hmm.
ways, is like academia. Um, and so, yeah, I've been in higher ed since. I have never worked like in a hospital system or anything like that. And I really have just stuck to the higher ed sphere.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And I'm so curious to hear. You talked just a moment ago about how the writing of research aligned with some of your strengths. If we can go back a little bit, because I've talked to a few other people that were in master's programs
Hmm.
and thinking they go on to a PhD as well in philosophy, and you with theology and philosophy. Um, what well, are there opportunities for you still professionally or personally to align that philosophy and theology interest into the work you do, whether that's in your day job or outside of it with any volunteering?
I haven't incorporated that. I think the closest was, being able to at Loyola find more alignment in terms of mission, but I
Hmm.
don't think really in my day-to-day work. I think a lot of the skills still are the same in terms of being able to like read a lot of resources and see like what information fits where. That
Yeah.
still aligns, but not in terms of like the theological like implications or practice. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Do you ever think you'd go back at some point in the future and try to pursue a PhD?
No, I don't. It's so
Yeah.
funny. I look at my peers now and some of them are just starting their careers or just finishing their PhDs. And I feel like I finished my master's like so long ago because it's such
Yeah.
a long road. The
Yeah.
average PhD in religion at Harvard is 8 years, and that doesn't include the master's.
Oh my.
I know. And so like that's like 10 years of graduate studies before you get like a full-time teaching job.
Yes.
Um, and the PhD I was in like theology specifically, and for those you have to learn French or German to do like original text research, and so there was like a language piece to it that was really intense as well. And um, I'm so happy. And there's like I don't know if you ever read Thomas Merton, The Seven Storey Mountain, but Thomas
Hmm.
Merton was a monk, a Catholic monk, and he would have visitors to the monastery. And one of his books, The Seven Storey Mountain, he makes a comment about how often those who like give money so people can take these vows of silence,
Hmm.
for the better good of God or whatnot, are in some ways like saints in their own rights because they can't take their own vows of silence. They're working businessmen or women,
Oh.
but they're doing the work that allows other people to do it, which is like in some ways like a grace. And so I've always taken it like
Wow.
helping people like align their philanthropic passions with like the greater good. It's like another way to like approach it, if that makes sense. So it's not
That
necessarily like,
does.
yeah, like you're not, I'm, letting people, giving to the people who really like should be doing the monastery work versus thinking that everyone should do the mission. It's like
Yeah.
an interesting approach. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I grew up Catholic, and
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that book, The Seven Storey Mountain. But
Mhm.
yeah, that I like to expose myself to other ways of thinking and other viewpoints, whether that's within theology or politics and such. So I like to check that book out.
Yeah, it's basically he was a man who was like an atheist growing up and
Hmm.
actually found God at Columbia.
Oh,
and was alive during the time of Dorothy Day. So a lot of rebellious Catholics. And
oh, interesting.
he actually did a lot in terms of like contemplation
Mm,
and prayer in the Buddhist tradition. And so he was really into that, actually, which is like really interesting for the time.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Oh, cool. Very
Hmm.
cool. And I think I one of the people I really admire and read quite a bit is Arthur Brooks, who um, is a professor at Harvard Business School and has a
Hmm.
teaching appointment at the Kennedy School as well. And
Hmm.
he has a weekly column in the Atlantic, and I believe he converted to Catholicism later in life, and
Hmm.
you can tell by some of his writings that the contemplation that you talked about and the ability to try to help other people, the desire to help other people, um, infuses a lot of his worldview, and it's really fascinating to see how someone can take their spiritual beliefs and bring it
Hmm.
into application in their lives and careers. So
Yeah, I'll have to look
yeah.
into him. He sounds so familiar, but I haven't read his piece in the Atlantics.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought, oh yeah, I do. I have it right here. This is his latest book. It came out earlier this year.
Hmm.
So um yeah, just a best-selling author, and
Nice.
I've actually used some of his work, and I attribute it to him in these interview questions. So
Oh, nice.
yeah, in fact, there
That's
is one
brilliant.
from him that I sent to you ahead of time.
Hmm.
If you want to dive into that one now, that might be a nice synergy.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Arthur Brooks, Harvard professor um, and an author, he's observed that when people first meet each other in social situations, they often, as they're trying to get to know the other person, they ask, what do you do for a living? Um, but he said, in quotes, but rarely do you hear, why do you do what you do? Why do you do the work that you spend so much of your life doing
Yeah.
beyond earning a paycheck? And so, if I could pose his question to you, why is it that you do the work that you do, specifically in prospect management research, or maybe just in higher education nonprofits in general?
I would say one of the reasons is I do believe in the impact of higher education. So I'm a first generation uh, immigrant and the first child in my family to enroll in a 4-year institution. And
Mm,
that in itself was like a leap of
awesome.
faith. That was like me applying blindly. And BC is actually need blind. And like I was able to go tuition free and my
Wow.
parents did not have to take on a lot of debt. And it afforded me so much experience that I wouldn't have been able to do if I stayed in Maryland or if I went to a community college. Like, for example,
Mm.
not only like social networks, but I was able to study abroad at Oxford.
Oh,
And
wow.
like if which is insane, like looking back, but it was one of those things that's like, that's an experience that it was so unique. And so knowing not what it can only do in terms of like life experience, but also like paradigm shifts for the individual, obviously like social economic growth. I think
Yeah.
also like, and I of course, like affording other uh, individuals the ability to do that via fundraising is like very impactful. I think the
Yeah.
work again is like, again, I'm a curious person and I do have a great desire to do impact. And so like, I think the work is impactful. I know a lot of
Mm.
shops struggle with like, how are we impactful? How are we moving the needle? How we can collaborate better? And I think
Yeah.
we all work through that, but I do think the work is like deeply, deeply impactful. And I've worked at shops where, gratefully that leadership has relied on prospect development a lot to be like, what do you think about this? And I think that's great
Oh, yeah.
and strategic. And I want to be like a strategy partner. That to me in the work is really, really amazing. And I wasn't always this way. I mean, when I was at Harvard, I think as an analyst, I was very much so like, like have my eyes on my keyboard and type all day and do ratings and do briefings and not really look to be like, why are we doing this? Or like, does the fundraiser need this? Or like, how is this answering questions? But the more I actually got involved in prospect management, less so research, I was able to connect the dots in a more impactful way, because prospect management at Harvard, when I started doing that around, I don't recall, like 2017, it was kind of like so scrappy because it was just me and Amy Begg that we had to be in front of people and make decisions and persuade people.
Yeah.
So that to me is really important, like doing impactful work. And I know we're impactful. And the third is right now, like I am so curious about what it takes to manage people well and coaching people. I think like in my own career, there were times where I'm like, I wish I had a better manager or a coach or a sponsor. And to me, like it is so important for me to like make sure my team feels supported and that they see themselves as leaders and they see themselves as people who have a say in the work, in the projects, and then the direction of like the department really. And I think that's a change for them, and that will take time. But again, I think a lot of shops can be reactive, but I'm just really big on one, like being impactful, but two, like being able to manage to people's strengths. And managing is so tough. Like,
yeah.
but to me, it's something that like I have a great desire to always improve upon, because there are a million things that you can say or not say that can build a relationship. And I'm like trying to always be intentional about that with my direct reports. Because to me, it's really important to like manage well and like build a great team. So those are the three things I would say: curiosity, impact, and then the management piece.
No, that's a wonderful answer. And I really appreciate you touching on several components of why you do what you do, Nhu. If I could take it from there, how many people do you manage at Booth?
Yeah, it's like funny, it's very hierarchical, but I manage two and they each manage like three-ish.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so like I'm the director, and then I have two senior associate directors who one runs research, one runs project management, which is actually great.
Okay.
Because they can have like insight into their own arms of the expertise essentially, and oversee the workflow. And I, each give them projects and whatnot, and then we have people under them. And now it seems odd to be so hierarchical for like a small team, but so I think in total it's like 5 or 6.
Oh, okay.
People on my
Dynamite.
team. Yeah.
And Nhu, if you could talk with us about, you mentioned intentionality and the experiences you had or didn't have in terms of your own nurturing from sponsors or managers in the past. What about those experiences do you draw upon as you're building your skills and trying to be intentional as a manager?
Yeah, there are a few. The first is like making sure I communicate often and clearly. I know that seems so odd, but I'm always sharing information. Like I don't try to hide anything. I think oftentimes I was once an analyst and I felt like I didn't receive a lot of information, and that could be me eventually going back to my desk and being like, are they keeping things from me because they don't think I can handle the information, or because of what? And so being clear about decisions that are coming from higher up, and that just includes being like, well, this is the decision so far, and a lot of it's unbaked, but this is where they are in the process. And that could be like remote work, or the way that they're approaching an HR decision or whatnot. But also like clear about my expectations. And so I have very specific expectations when it comes to like, when I present, I want them to also be mindful of people's time. I like people to have like agendas and map out like presentations in a certain way, and being clear about my expectations of what it means to be successful is like really important to me. So I'm always like in our team meetings, like iterating on like, is my vision clear? Like, are my expectations clear? Because I think a lot of times, like, it's like, what does good look like? And people aren't sure. And so me being clear on what I think good looks like. And that we're working on this now as a team, not always necessarily being like, I have to finish all the rating requests, but like measuring our work by impactfulness, which I know is a bit more ambiguous, but like shifting from a Q mindset to a more of like an impact mindset has been something we're working on. I think other things, just, I think making sure, particularly in a remote environment, bringing the team together. And that's been important for me as a new leader on a team. We have half our team is fully remote and half comes in. And so making sure we make time for that. So it's like, just like a lot of little things, I think. And again, I'm kind of like you. I'm always like reading HBR or like just like books about like how to better do things, because I always want to be learning as a manager. There's a lot out there.
Yes.
But like to make sure that I myself am learning about those things and not stuck in my ways about like how things should or shouldn't be.
Yeah, I really like that. I think sometimes it's easy to fall into the habits of, oh, this is working great, so I'm just going to stick to it and not work on my management skills. So, kudos to you for this, continuous improvement approach. When you do ask your team, is my vision clear or am I communicating clearly? Have there been instances where their feedback has been, there's room for improvement, and how do you take that and then try and meet what you feel like you've mapped out with their feedback that they need more detail or more emphasis or such?
Yeah, the primary feedback I've gotten a lot on is like, interestingly, like what you just said, which is like, well, we don't do it that way, or I don't think that's going to work because leadership in the past said they don't like that.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm new enough where I haven't had much pushback on the other end being like, that wasn't what we wanted. I think part of it, I've been also very explicit about like accepting my failures and making sure as a team that we appreciate over anything else a growth mindset over perfection. And so I will say like, right, like we can try this and it will fail, and that's amazing. Like, and so don't be afraid to be like, we're going to change this template, which is something so small, but it will save us hours over the course of a month. Even if like leadership doesn't like that. And so working on being like, I'll take care of the change management, the higher up, but like, let's not change because we feel like someone 3 years ago said like they don't like this font or something like that. Right. Yeah, or like little things. Like I think my team, it's interesting. Like how people approach, like Chicago has a very specific approach to ratings that I think was a bit different than Harvard, and they like rely heavily on like, I feel like Harvard, we were more willing to assess wealth because we knew there was just so much wealth there on indicators that weren't black and white. And here, I think sometimes they maybe are conservative about the ratings because they're just so focused on the things they can find. And me pushing people on that as well is like something we have to coach through. But that's like a paradigm shift.
Interesting.
But all of it being like, well, at any instance being like, push back if you feel so uncomfortable doing this. Like if you don't want to rate people this way because it's like, or you need more, a lot of people have said like, Nhu, you need to, when I was like, I think our ratings are conservative, people were like, you need more citations, like you need more references. And so I had to like look at WealthX articles and like, like just like professional and academic articles about wealth. And I wasn't able to find much in terms of like verifying why we think a certain level of wealth should be rated more. But I've had that specific pushback being like, you need to provide more proof because it's a very proof heavy culture. Like you need to come with your receipts, you need to come with your like papers. And so there are definitely certain things like the ratings piece that I haven't been able to change because I don't think, again, I have enough evidence necessarily.
I see.
I think that's just kind of the part of the culture. So I have to pick my battles, and for that one, I'm shelving it for now.
Yeah. Sometimes it's all about the timing of a situation.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Interesting. Nhu, how have you? So let's back up a little bit, because you left Harvard and in what, 2019?
2020. Yeah. So I was
2020.
remote for Harvard for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you went to Loyola, correct? Okay. And now you're at Booth. So all of those three institutional stops and transitions have been during the pandemic. So if you could just talk with us about, how have you used, if you've had, time to come up for air with relocating and getting familiar with the employer and the culture and the team. But during this pandemic, have you been able to use time and energy to reflect on your core values as a professional and goals you have, whether they're short-term or longer-term goals for yourself?
I think it is interesting. It seems like the pandemic would be a great time to do that, but it has been a lot of go, go, go.
Yes.
I'm not sure how it's been for you, Tim. I
Yeah.
think my goals really haven't changed since I started. I think the biggest thing for me really is like leaning into, so I wasn't able to manage at Harvard. And one of the reasons I left was because I was fully remote, and it was clear that fully remote staff wouldn't be able to like manage more, and that makes sense for the institution. And so my big thing being like, what does it mean to like run a team, is something that I was new to me during my last role at Loyola, where it was the first time I was a director.
Oh, nice.
So like, what does it mean to run your own prospect research and management program? What do you want that to look like? Like, how should that differ from the person down the street? Or like, what does it look like for your institution and your fundraisers' needs?
Yeah.
Those were the things that I was trying to figure out. And my goals being, again, like my big thing with prospect development, like being the most strategic that we can to make sure we have a seat at the table. And luckily I've been at places where I've had that chance. One at Booth, interestingly, like we do a lot of partnership in different ways, but one of the things we don't do is we don't sit and strategize with fundraisers. At Harvard, we used to have these like Monday, it was called the 12 p.m. meeting, and I had to go to them for like 4 years. And at the time I was like, the 12:30 meeting where we talk about prospects. But I wish we would have that at Booth, because it meant that everyone came together to think about strategy on prospects. And my team here hasn't historically had that exposure, and that's hard to get when you're not invited. And so, but me really wanting deeply for them to see themselves as like consultants and strategy partners, and me kind of like forcing them to build those relationships somehow. And so that was a big thing for me, I think, in terms of goals that I established for myself, especially now at Booth, but also at Loyola, being like, how are we strategy partners and how are we using our time?
Yeah. Oh, very cool. I want to be mindful of time here, Nhu. We've got about 10 minutes left in the episode. And I've had a few guests on the People in Fundraising podcast over the last few months. Jessica McNeil from Harvard Business School and Neda Jimenez from Northeastern University. I worked with both of them at HBS in the past. And they've talked a little bit candidly about some of the challenges they've had with, and some of it resonates with what you've been saying too, with mentorship and management and sponsorship early in their careers. And they've talked about how connecting with people of color, people of similar backgrounds, educational institutions have been helpful for them. And so, like, for example, Neda talked about this beautiful rainbow of people of colors that she's trying to organize in Boston. I just wondered, in your career to date, have you found this, maybe some similar experiences to what Neda and Jessica talked about, as well as, how have you is there a network in Chicago that has been very helpful for you in your career and in relocating from Cambridge?
I think in my career, it was interesting. It wasn't something I really noticed until later, that there weren't a lot of Asian prospect researchers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think there is like a group for it. Like, I don't know, there's an Asian and Pacific Islander like prospect development group anywhere.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh-huh.
One thing that's been helpful for me is connecting with just people of color in the office. And I remember when I came to Booth, there was a fundraiser who was also from Vietnam, who was also first
Mm.
generation. And she was just
Oh.
like, I can't believe I found you. And I was like, same, like, how is it possible? Because she'd never met another person from Vietnam who was in fundraising, like at all, like
Wow.
like researcher, advancement services, gift processing, like none of that. And so
Wow.
it was kind of amazing to find her, because we had such similar backgrounds, but and she actually lived on the West Coast, and we both worked at different institutions, across the country, and never
Yeah.
met another Vietnamese fundraising professional. And
Wow.
so
Mm.
those intimate relationships, I think, are super helpful. I think the other thing that's helpful, more recently, and I'm not sure why, if it's a pandemic thing or whatnot, but following leaders of color on
Mm.
either, who lead or on case faculty or on LinkedIn. So one name
Yeah.
that comes to mind is like Peter Hayashida, who used to be president of UC Riverside
Mm.
Foundation, and he retired, but is so prolific on LinkedIn with his
Mm.
messaging about his vision for the industry, about what it means to be a good leader. And he's very vocal. And he doesn't know me at all, but I like read everything that he publishes because I find it so inspiring. And he's a case faculty member. I think now he's more private sector consulting, but like seeing
Mm.
people like that. And so he's at the tail end of his career. He's like retired, to know that
Yeah.
he in his life, like, worked decades in fundraising, probably as the only person of color a lot of times, and is
Mm.
now seen it to the other side, like as a retired person who like does consulting, for fun,
Sure.
but still contributing to the industry and has like a strong voice, has been very inspiring for me. I mean, I do wish I would see more women of color in leadership positions.
Mm.
I think the industry is changing. I'm sure it looks much different now than it did, 20, 30, 50 years ago. But
Yeah.
I haven't in Chicago. And I think part of it is just like I moved here, I moved here actually when I was like 7 months pregnant, but then like the pandemic happened.
Oh,
And so like
goodness.
just haven't connected with like groups here in Chicago.
Yes.
Um, and I don't think there is like an Asian prospect research or development group. I haven't found,
Yeah.
but yeah, I kind of relate to what Jessica and Nada were saying in terms of like their challenges, particularly seeing, I mean, I know this is a known fact that like most of fundraising is still female, but most of fundraising leadership is still male.
Right.
So there's just discrepancies all around. But I think overall the industry is changing, and um, I feel like in 20 years it will be more equal in terms of representation, that we'll have more female leadership.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think the industry has been changing, and um, there's still a lot more work to do in that
Mhm.
sense. And 20 years in my career, I've noticed that there have been some changes, but still room for improvement. And so I really appreciate your important perspective on this topic, Nhu.
Yeah, thank
Um,
you.
yeah. So, any last thoughts, Nhu, as we get to the almost to the top of the hour here? Anything you'd like to share with our audience? Anything we haven't covered? If there are a few other questions. If you wanted to go through one of those, I'd be happy to give you that time.
think so. I would just say that, again, to reiterate to people who, I don't know if new people in the industry would listen to this podcast, but I think when you start, you have a hard time finding your footing. You're like, is this for me? Like, is this who I am?
Yes.
And that, like, through APRA, or like, obviously, like, I'm sure when, I'm still a part of NEDRA, and that there is a lot of community here. And Tim, you're building it with this podcast, and that's amazing. And just seeing the great work of peers in this space and saying, like, this is like a place where you could be and succeed and have a home professionally. Making that known, I think, is like important to me. I work with some people who are more junior, and I think a lot of times they're like, what is this? Or like, like, do I want to do this? And I'm like, yeah, you're good at it. Like, you can do it. And just encouraging people to be like, you can really craft a lot from this community, from this profession, and really encouraging that. I think this is a great space for that, Tim. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I really appreciate your compliments and your kudos, Nhu. And I agree with you that, I'm thinking back to my beginnings as a temp and then a very junior research analyst. And you mentioned a phrase at the beginning that I really liked. You mentioned like an existential moment or point in your life where you're just trying to figure out, what do I want to do? Why do I want to do it? Where do I want to do it? You mentioned Boston College and a year in Oxford, and just a rich experience in those formative years of it as a young professional, a young person. And I think that's so true. Like, when I think back to, like, when I started, I was still living with my parents.
Yeah, really?
And I was taking, it was an hour and a half train ride each way to Harvard Business School. And I can empathize with people on your team, and maybe you as well. Early days, like, am I good at this? Do I want to do this? And not having it mapped out, just kind of like the days rolled into weeks, into months, and I'm like, oh my goodness, 3 years later, I get promoted, and okay, like this feels good at that point. There was a nice moment of clarity coming out of that existential phase of, still trying to figure things out. So I really liked how you phrased that.
Yeah, we're actually having like a retreat that I'm leading for all the teams at UChicago. So like Harvard, we're decentralized. We all have like our own research and prospect management teams, and we're having a retreat, and I'm inviting people from the industry, some who manage, some who don't manage, some who are AVPs, and some who went private, to be like, this is where your career could look like, and it doesn't have to look a certain way. Because I think, like, when you're starting out, you're like, what do I have to run a team, or do I am I just an assistant director forever? And being like, there are so many different paths. None of them are clear. Like, honestly, like, I've seen so many people in the industry go different directions, but these are some people who've done it before. So I'm excited for that. I hope it goes well, but
if you need a speaker, or maybe just someone to share some ideas, I had a previous guest back in June, Colette Wixom Call, who's at the University of San Diego, and she is she's working toward a PhD. I mean, you mentioned that earlier. And one of the things she wants to do is just research on the nonprofit world. And one of the things that she has noticed is that, in a lot of nonprofit settings, there is this drive to become a manager. And her step back question is, well, what if they don't want to be a manager? Like, what are their options? So, we can talk offline if that might be something of interest to you. I'm not sure exactly what she has put together, but I know that was a topic of hers that she talked about on this program.
How interesting.
But I wish you the best with that. That sounds really interesting.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. It's been great to catch up with you, Nhu, and thank you for your wide-ranging conversation: theology, philosophy, management, just getting a sense of the team culture and what works, what doesn't, and the why of some resistance to change. I think
Mhm.
that's something we all grapple with. So it's been really a very enriching conversation. I appreciate your time, Nhu.
My pleasure. Have a good one, Tim.
Thank you, you too.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.